Welcome to this episode of the podcast Nicaea at 1700. In this episode, we will be discussing the topic of the reception of Nicaea, that is, the reception of the Council of Nicaea from the period after the council down to close to the Reformation. We probably won't get to the Reformation, and that's quite all right. But what we're interested in this episode is to think about how the Council of Nicaea was received, both in the eastern part of the empire, that is the Eastern Church or the Orthodox Byzantine Church, and also in the Latin West. And with us to talk about this is Professor George Demacopoulos. George is the Father John Meyendorff and Patterson Family Chair of Orthodox Christian Studies at Fordham University. He serves as chair of the Senior Fellows in Byzantine Studies, Dumbarton Oaks, and as president of the Byzantine Studies Association of North America. He is also the co-editor of the Journal of Orthodox Christian Studies, and along with Aristotle Papanicolaou, George co-founded the Orthodox Christian Studies Center at Fordham. Professor Demacopoulos earned a Master's of Theological Studies from Holy Cross before he continued on pursuing his doctoral studies at the University of North Carolina. His research and teaching interests are in the fields of early Christian and medieval Byzantine Christian or church history. He specializes in the relationship between Orthodox and Roman Catholics during the Middle Ages, and among his many publications, a few of them include most recently a monograph entitled Sacralizing Violence in Byzantium, Hymns, Empire, and the Narrowing of Christian Identity, a co-edited book on Nicaea and the future of Christianity, as well as a recent book on the, well, actually, no, recent, I'll say recent, a book on Gregory the Great. I know George has worked on Gregory the Great for quite a while, but a book on St. Gregory the Great, Pope of Rome, entitled Ascetic Pastor and First Man of Rome, that's subtitle, and then a really impressive work that I find extremely useful in my teaching and research, The Invention of Peter, the development and reception of the Petrine discourse at the close of Christian antiquity. Professor Demacopoulos, George, a colleague, friend, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Dr. Skedros. Jim, we've been friends many years. I'm delighted to do this.
Thanks. So let's get started with kind of a general question here, which is what I really want for us to chat about is, and not so much going into great detail on this, but the reception of Nicaea, that is after the council wraps up in the summer of 325. We do know that for the next 60, 70 years or so, that the reception and especially the creed was controversial. I wonder if you could give us sort of a brief overview of that challenge or the challenges facing Nicaea and perhaps the creed in particular, the Creed of Nicaea, down to which we usually put, the end of this, at least the question about the word homoousios, et cetera, down to the Council of Constantinople in 381.
I mean, this kind of is, it's surprising, I think, to people when they first get into church history and Orthodox Christian history, especially because they think Nicaea is so important. Well, of course, everybody loved it. Well, the fact of the matter is, it was actually really a controversial event, its reception. And I guess the simplest way to explain it is it was controversial for two completely different reasons. One's theological and one's political. It's controversial theologically because the key phrase, homoousion, right? The notion that the Father and the Son are of the same essence or the same nature, depending on how you defined it. I mean, we understand it today to mean they're both fully God, right? That term is not biblical. And because it's not biblical, the opponents of Nicaea were able to rhetorically, and I think effectively rhetorically, claim that Nicaea had been an innovation, that it was not the authentic tradition because it was not a scriptural term. Now, the Orthodox response to that, of course, is that, well, even if it's not precisely a biblical term, it is the logical theological conclusion of the scriptures, right? And so it's a theological debate about can you have key creedal phrases that are not themselves precisely biblical? So that's the theological reason that it becomes controversial. And then the political reason that it becomes controversial is that Nicaea was, not everybody likes this interpretation, but Nicaea was very much an imperial affair, right? It was, even though Constantine was not yet a Christian, he saw it in his own political best interest to bridge competing factions within the Christian tradition. And while he does not appear to have intervened in the deliberations at Nicaea, he very much had a vested interest in promoting the conclusion of Nicaea. And he tried that for a little bit, only to realize that the Nicene position, the Homoousion position, was actually the minority view across the empire. And so he shifted his position, as did all of his sons. And so what happens is because Nicaea is the minority view, the politicians went with the majority view and they shifted their position and went with a kind of middle approach. Sometimes it's referred to as the semi-Arian approach. And so there's a series of councils in the 330s, 340s, 350s, 360s, largely engineered by the state with the support of bishops. And nearly every single one of those councils takes this non-Orthodox semi-Arian position. And so to be attached to Nicaea was theologically to sort of mark yourself as uh, a non-traditionalist, and to be attached to Nicaea was a way to mark yourself as someone who isn't going to just go along with the emperor.
That's extremely helpful. Do you have a sense, and maybe this is actually a question more about Constantine, do you have a sense that he had any kind of theological commitment to one side or the other?
Well, yeah, that's a great question, and I guess I mean, are we talking about his career in total, or are we talking about his career at a particular moment, right? Because my sense is that he changes his opinion a series of a few times, and he changes his position on some of the key figures a few times. So by the end of his life, he is actually closest with the leaders of the Arian party, especially Eusebius of Nicomedia, who baptizes him, and the father of church history, Eusebius of Caesarea, who also clearly had Arian sympathies. Um, he exiles Saint Athanasius. So again, at the later part of his career, he seems to have clearly taken sides with the Arians. Now, I don't think it's because he has a specific theological commitment. I'm not even sure he fully understands the situation. My reading is that he is a pragmatic politician and he is trying to build the largest consensus possible. One of the things, again, I don't mean to scandalize people, but I think it's helpful to have an honest accounting of history and to understand it. Constantine does not stop his patronage of pagan religious cults uh, when he's emperor. He's actually supporting all religious traditions at the
Mhm.
same time because he's a good Roman emperor. He sees religious cult as something that's important for the promotion of the empire. He clearly privileges Christianity. He builds Hagia Sophia. He builds the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. He grants the land for the building of St. Peter's on Vatican Hill. He's clearly privileging Christianity, but I don't think he has a sort of nuanced theological appreciation of the difference between the Nicene and the Arian claim.
Thank you. Okay. So the other two kind of decisions that were reached at there's a third decision with Meletios in Alexandria, but that's kind of ancillary to the subsequent history. But what about the canons and the definition or the decision about the celebration of Easter? Do we have a sense of whether they were controversial, whether they're accepted? People just said, okay, this is what Nicaea decided, and we'll accept it and move on.
Yeah, let me take those separately. So the canons are important. They're one of the only actual surviving sources that we have. We don't have, unlike all of the other ecumenical councils, we don't have the acts of the speeches that were made and the deliberations. We only have Eusebius's account written decades later. So our information is largely unreliable, but we do have the canons. So you ask, what's their reception? Is it controversial? Well, we don't really have anybody complaining about the canons. So maybe it's an argument from silence, but I would suggest that the canons are generally well received. I'll note a few things about these particular canons. The first is that they are almost entirely, well, they're of two sorts. They are largely administrative, and to my mind, the most significant thing about them is the church is kind of overnight conforming to imperial structures.
Mhm.
So even the notion that a bishop's jurisdiction is going to be bounded by a geographical space, and that geographical space is a mirror of the way that the Roman government divides its provinces for the raising of taxes. That is just absorbed whole scale without any seemingly reflection about whether or not that's a good idea. And there are a few examples of this in those canons. And then there are a series of canons about episcopal authority, but those two reflect ongoing current sort of Roman imperial structures. So so that's really significant for the subsequent history of the church and the imperialization of the church and its administration and its structures. There are also some uh, how shall I say, there are a few canons about church behavior. The canons themselves do not get into theological issues, right? The canons are dealing with behavior, and the canons are dealing with administrative structures. We don't seem to have any repudiation of these specific canons, even though specific aspects of these canons will be revised or even rejected by subsequent canons from subsequent councils. The date of Easter is really, really important. To my mind, it's one of the most important things that comes out of the council because prior to the Council of Nicaea, Christians are commemorating Easter in a wide variety of different ways, and Constantine is trying to get the church and the empire to sort of celebrate Easter on a similar date. We know so the formula that we use today, the formula that Roman Catholics use today, it's the exact same formula of Nicaea. The first Sunday after the first full moon, after the first day of spring. We do know that not everybody accepts this. And so Eusebius is writing decades later, and he's still aware that there are pockets, even within the empire, let alone outside of the empire, that are not adhering to this. Constantine's aware of it. He's trying to force it. People are rejecting it. One of the problems that we face in the modern church, we use the exact same formula as the Roman Catholics, but the challenge we have is the formula identified at Nicaea doesn't do a lot of things, right? It's kind of vague. First Sunday after the first full moon, after the first day of spring. Well, how do you know when the first day of spring is? How are you marking that? And where are you measuring it from? Are you measuring it from Rome, from Jerusalem, from Constantinople, from New York? Um, what scientific model are you using to establish the first date of spring? Right? The Alexandrians are using a different mathematical model than the Christians of Rome, and that's why they're not celebrating Easter on the same day. Um, so uh, we don't seem to have rejection of the canons, even though later councils will revise them. We do seem to have some resistance to the common date of Easter, um, but it will over time come to be the dominant way that Easter is commemorated within the empire.
Another question regarding sort of the reception of Nicaea in that, and here the question is always been for me, at what point does Nicaea become like a flag for orthodoxy? So when does Nicaea, because you always hear the faith of the fathers of the 318 fathers, uh, you already told us that it's controversial up to at least 381, right? So maybe for some people it's a flag of orthodoxy, but not universally. Is there a sense of maybe even, well, why, if you want to attach that or attack that, why it becomes the flag, but also when, if you could say, do we have like a historical moment, time period where we could say that, oh, now if you don't agree with Nicaea, you're just out of the church.
Yeah, 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 yeah. So I think the Second Council in 381 becomes really important. Um, uh, One of the problems with the Council of Nicaea, like the original creed and the original formulation, is it did a really good job of explaining what the Father and Son have in common. It did a very bad job of explaining then what differentiates them. And as you kind of learn in first semester of seminary, that comes subsequently. And that's what's known sometimes as the Cappadocian settlement. So it's the writing of St. Gregory the theologian, St. Basil, St. Gregory of Nyssa. It's the insertion of this term hypostasis and the distinction between ousia and hypostasis. Anyway, this is very theological. Um, but that formula is established in the late 370s and early 380s. And that revised way of sort of nuancing the claim of Nicaea is established at 381. And because it has imperial support, and imperial support in a way that never goes away, 381 becomes the moment when Nicaea becomes the faith of the empire. And for Romans living in the empire, it just becomes the kind of defunct way of thinking about what it means to be a Christian. Now, what's interesting is the primary missions to the Goths and to other Germanic tribes that occurred in that period between Nicaea and the Second Council. And so when those missionaries were converting the Goths, they were converting them to Arian Christianity. And after 381, these Germanic tribes seem to hold on to a form of Arian Christianity as a way, a deliberate way of marking themselves as different from the Romans. Yes, they're Christians, but they're Christians of a different sort. And so while it is the case that Nicaea becomes the kind of de facto orthodoxy for Romans living inside the empire, it is not the de facto orthodoxy for the Germanic tribes, either inside the empire or outside of it. And this, of course, will become problematic in lots of different ways. And then in subsequent councils, right, once you have the pattern of resolving theology, that in many ways, this is one of the most important things about Nicaea. Nicaea establishes the pattern for how you resolve major theological controversies by convening bishops in council with the support of the state. They pay for it, they promote it, and so forth. And that becomes the received way of how you fix a theological crisis for the entire Byzantine period. Sometimes they're more effective at it than others. And so Nicaea becomes emblematic of that model. And so when you have the subsequent councils, they are constantly reiterating the fact that this is the faith of Nicaea, this is the faith of Nicaea, so forth and so on, even though they are adding to the deposit of dogma in terms, especially in terms of Christology, quite significantly from what the original Nicaea had done.
Thank you. And the first canon that is Canon 1 of the Council of Constantinople of 381 begins with an acknowledgement of the 318 fathers at Nicaea. And so we're gonna kind of do what they did. We're gonna resolve issues in council, and there is kind of, this is the faith. And then, as you mentioned, it just keeps get building on. And fascinating about the Goths. I just wonder to what extent are Gothic theologians that concerned about their Aryan identity, or is it more political identity? And if you want to answer that,
Yeah.
that's great. If not, I'm just
No,
curious.
I'm not the scholar to answer this. I know it's a thing,
Right,
and it's really curious as to
right,
why
right.
it's a
But I
thing.
like the
Yeah,
political piece of it because to
yeah,
differentiate us from, we are the new rulers in the West,
yeah,
and we are different than the old rulers because they have a little different faith.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
So we've done an episode on the distinction between the Creed of Nicaea and the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed.
yeah,
So I don't want to get into the development because we have an episode on that, but most of our listeners will know about the change made to the Nicene Creed, Nicaea Constantinopolitan Creed, that is made in the Latin West with the addition of the phrase, the word filioque,
yeah,
added to it, that the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, filioque.
yeah,
That becomes a really an important insertion in the West, and it also becomes a real bone of contention between the Latin Church and the Greek Church. I wonder if you could give us a brief sort of synopsis of when it gets added, why it gets added, and some of the controversies around it. And I know we could spend hours on this, but kind of put that in context, even though it's post-Nicaea, but it's the
right,
Nicene
right.
Creed, as we know, being
Yeah,
being, being
yeah, yeah,
added to.
yeah. So, well, I'm glad we spoke a little bit about the Aryans, because the issue is as these Germanic tribes sort of settle across the early medieval West, it seems to be the case that some well-intentioned Catholic Orthodox priest in Spain at the end of the 5th century, as a way to try to explain to the Arians that their theological view is wrong, right? That the Son is equal to the Father, right? The Son is God, right? That's the Arian problem, that they don't see the Son as fully God, as equal to the Father. So some enterprising Arian adds this phrase to the Latin translation of the Creed, so that when talking about the Holy Spirit, they say the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, and together with the Father and Son is worshipped and glorified. In other words, what the Arian priest, or sorry, what the Catholic priest is trying to do for the benefit of the Arians is to explain to them, look, the Son is so important that the Holy Spirit comes from him, just as it comes from the Father. And this makes sense in the priest's mind because the Father and Son are equal, right? That's the Nicene thing. All right. Um, this begins innocently, 5th century Spain, uh, as Christianity grows among the barbarian tribes in Spain. It spreads a little north from there. And it is kind of an unknown thing that is circulating among the Germanic tribes as part of their catechism. Again, it's a way to bring the Arians around to orthodoxy. But it becomes this addition in the Latin Creed. Nobody in the Eastern Church knows that they're doing it. In the beginning, seemingly none of the Romans of the West know that they're doing it. By the 9th century, All of the Germanic tribes are doing it, and the most of the original Romans are not, right? So the papacy is never using filioque um, in any practical or functional way before the 10th century. But what happens in the ninth century is you have Byzantine missionaries attempting to convert the Slavs, and you have Frankish missionaries attempting to convert the Slavs. And in a kind of competition where you have Cyril and Methodius on the one hand, and you have these Frankish missionaries on the other, both trying to convert the same communities, it becomes apparent for the very first time that the two churches are using a slightly different creed. And just as we said about the problem of Nicaea, this then becomes a theological problem, but it also, in a sense, becomes a kind of cultural and political opportunity. And what I mean by that is um, it's a theological question as to whether or not filioque is appropriate. The Byzantines will almost always consistently say it's a problem for a number of reasons I can go into if you want. But it becomes a political and cultural opportunity for in a highly competitive evangelical space for the Byzantines to sort of mark themselves as different from the Latins, and for the Latins to mark themselves as, in fact, they're not even Latins, they're Franks, and for the Franks to mark themselves as different um, from the Byzantines. And so it becomes this tool of difference, political, cultural, economic, and so forth. And it's not, yes, the mission to the Slavs is, of course, about saving the souls of the Slavs, but nothing is ever that simple. It is also an opportunity for economic expansion. It is an opportunity for military expansion. It's an opportunity for political influence. And so all of these things get wrapped up. And so what had begun centuries earlier, the end of the 5th century in Spain, as an innocent attempt to bring the Arians around to orthodoxy, ends up being both a theological problem and this tool of difference that's going to get exploited.
Why? So let me follow up. Why were the Byzantines, you said theologically, and maybe you could just say just a couple of words about
Yeah.
why the Eastern Church was against this phrase, the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. Right. The Gospel of John says, I will send the Spirit, Spirit of truth, who proceeds from the Father. So it's not scriptural per se
Right.
in that context. And I've also heard that that the Byzantines will make the argument that you can't add to the creed unless you gather in an ecumenical
Right.
council. I wonder if you could respond to both of those. I know
Yeah.
that those are questions that the Byzantines had or issues.
Yeah, well, th those are two obvious ones. I mean, there are a number of issues. One is actually, if you'll allow me, a kind of theological paradigm that
Hmm.
the the Byzantine conceptualization of the Trinity is frankly almost entirely derivative of the writing of Saint Gregory the theologian. And St. Gregory the theologian, when he's in Constantinople at in the lead up to that Second Ecumenical Council, he's trying to explain the difference between ousia and hypostases, and he's trying to explain the difference between the one and the three and the one. And so he comes up with this model where any attribute that belongs to all three, and we attribute it the level of ousia, at the level of nature. And anything that is unique to one of the three, like the sun being sun, um, belongs only at the level of hypostasis. And he says explicitly, there can't be an attribute that is possessed by only two, right? It's either something either belongs to all three and it's the Godhead, or it belongs to one of the three individually, Father, Son, Spirit, right? One of the unique characteristics of the Father is that the Father is the arche, which is a rich philosophical Greek word, which means he's the source. So the Father is the source of both the Son and Spirit. So this is kind of theologically, this is the foundation of the way that the Byzantines understand the mystery of the three and the one and the three. What the filioque does is it proposes an alternative model because the filioque is basically proposing that there is, in fact, something really, really important that only two of the three have in common, and that is that both the Son and the Father are the source of the Spirit. And so that breaks the Nazianzen, St. Gregory the Theologian's sort of understanding principle for the rules of the Trinity. And so I would make the case that that is the fundamental problem. And then once you have that fundamental problem, there are several things that the Byzantines can cherry pick as a way to say that you can't have this. The first is that it's not explicitly scriptural, and it's not. The Gospel of John does say that the Spirit proceeds from the Father. But at the same time, the Gospel of John also has Christ saying that he will send the Spirit, right? And so if you're thinking ontologically, like before time, the Spirit proceeds only from the Father. But if you're thinking economically, in terms of how the Spirit acts in history, then the Spirit proceeds from the Son as well. Anyway, but so they can cherry pick the scriptural thing. They can cherry pick that it's not the original text. And they can further claim that subsequent ecumenical councils said you can't revise the creed, you can't revise dogma without consultation in an ecumenical council, right? And then they'll go on with more and more and more and more arguments, right? Um, on the Frankish side of things, they don't know that it's not the original creed, right? As far as they know, it is. Um, And they don't really have, I mean, they're working in a kind of rudimentary Latin, which as a language, I think is about a fifth the size of Greek. So it doesn't allow for the sort of philosophical nuance that Greek does. Um, and so they aren't really able to keep up theologically. And this just becomes a kind of divisive break. Later, much smarter Latin theologians like Anselm and Thomas will also take up this issue, and they'll put forth a good. I mean, they'll make intelligent arguments, but they can't really get around most of the things that the Byzantines are arguing.
Thank you for that. So, I don't want to keep you too long, but I do want to ask you a sort of an academic question, but it's also a personal question. So, you're an academic. You're also a believing Christian, practicing Christian, Orthodox Christian, and you've been thinking, teaching about Nicaea for a long time.
Yeah.
You've been thinking a lot about Nicaea for the last year, given the 1700th anniversary. And I wonder if you want to just share your thoughts on Nicaea as a historian, as an instructor, a teacher, a professor, and as a believing Christian.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, I mean, Nicaea really is um, outside of scripture. It's probably the single most important event in the history of the church that still has meaning for the church. I mean, Constantine's legalization of Christianity um, is probably the most important event in kind of the history of the world, right? Just because it changes the entire nature of Western civilization. But in terms of what it means for the church, the Council of Nicaea is really, really, really important. More for the model that it established, the kind of synodality that it established, um, the need to sort of build consensus theologically, establishing the pattern of how you resolve theological questions. That is absolutely crucial um, for the church, and so forth. I think sometimes we overplay or I think sometimes we confuse what is sort of historically accidental from what is theologically necessary, right? Or maybe accidental is the wrong word, but coincidental. Um, I personally do not see Nicaea's appropriation of imperial structures as something theologically significant. I see it as purely administratively coincidental. Um, that's me personally. That's, built on decades of studying this and thinking about it. Not everybody's going to agree with me about this. Um, but that distinction between what is theologically significant of Nicaea and what is historically coincidental of Nicaea will actually become the sandbox, so to speak, in which historians and theologians are doing their work in the contemporary world, right? Because how do we resolve questions today? Well, I would say we we need to be faithful to the traditions of the fathers. We need to be faithful to Scripture. We need to be faithful to the method of synodality endorsed and employed at Nicaea. Do we need to be loyal to an empire that no longer exists? I don't think so. Um, but there are other intelligent, faithful people who would disagree with me. But that's sort of how I've come around to think about Nicaea now.
George, thank you.
Yeah.
I want to thank you on behalf of the Scriptorium Initiative here at Holy Cross for taking the time to join this interview. It's been enlightening. It's always good to see you, and your insights are always crisp and exceptionally useful. Thank you so much, George.
Thank you, Jim. Good to see you.
A special thank you to the St. Romanos the Melodist Choir of Helena College and Holy Cross Greek Orthodox School of Theology for their rendition of the Apolitikion of the Elevation of the Holy Cross. The artistic director of the choir is Reverend Dr. Romanos Karanis.